with us. Welcome to our time of Q&A. It's so good to have you joining us wherever you are joining us from. Really appreciate you making the time. So we're just going to just give it a couple of moments just for people just to log on and to join us. We do that, and I just finished my drink. A word from our sponsor. Not yet, but if you want to sponsor us, Coca-Cola, then I would be I would welcome it. My preference is no sugar. But it's as I said, it's good to have you here with us, and it's I really appreciate you investing this time. And excuse me. It's really good to have you investing this time, and I appreciate it as we just continue to wrestle with what it means to live out our faith in the world in which we find ourselves. Certainly tonight there's a mixture of questions, some really good questions, some really challenging questions, and I'm really grateful for that. Not so much in terms of the challenge to me, but what it says about the way that you're challenging yourself to live out of the fullness of faith and to be all that you can be and make a difference. So I really appreciate that. Let's just get into a couple of them here as we work through. I'm without one of my helpers tonight, so if I'm looking a bit distracted, it's because I'm not 100% sure how to do everything. Well, she did tell me, but I'm not 100% sure. So, okay. There was one question which seems to have disappeared, which is an easy question to deal with, which was along the lines of, really enjoyed the sermon this morning. Is it recorded? The short answer is the 10:30 service was recorded on MP3. It will be up on our website, alc.org.nz tomorrow, along with last week's. We haven't been posting the MP3s because during lockdown we've been recording, but we are going back to MP3s as well as the video. The MP3s are taken from the 10:30 service. The video it's pre-recorded for the online service, and it's got a slightly different flavour, as does the 8:30 as well. So if you want to sort of get the culmination of two practices, I guess, listen to the online 10:30. So it will be there. Okay. Well, there's some questions coming in. That's really great. Let me just get rid of this. Yep. Okay. So let's jump into it. There's some good, I'm not sure if some of them are statements or questions. If you're posting a question, can you just, I'm really simple. If you could just put a question mark after it, then that would help me know, because I'm not sure whether some of them are questions or not. Anyway, let's jump in. Where do you draw the line between harmless racist jokes, judgmental thoughts, and prejudice? Wow. Where do you draw the line? For me, if there is no line, I guess one of the things that I've become aware of is that it's very easy to excuse things under the rubrics of humour. I think there's a place for humour. There's no question of that, because humour is a way of diffusing things. It's a way of raising some topics at times. But I think that I don't think there's anything that's, I don't think you can have harmless racism, I guess would be the best way of putting it. If you're the person who's asking where's the line between harmless racist jokes and judgmental thoughts and prejudices, the line is on the other side of harmless. I would put harmless racist jokes, judgmental thoughts and prejudices all on the same side of the line. Because even if it's a joke, if it's racist, it is putting somebody down. And that in and of itself is not what we should be indulging in any shape or form as Christians, let alone non-Christians. That's not to say that we can't have jokes, but they can't be racist in that way. And I think it's one of these little things that I think we need to become more aware of. Certainly I've had to become more aware of it in the way that we use humour. So that would be my view on that one. Okay. gosh, these are so good. We may not actually get through all of these. In fact, we may actually come back and pick some of these up, because clearly it's raised a lot of issues for people, not just the message this morning, but I think also what we see happening around the world is deeply impacting us more than just emotionally. I think it's touching a nerve spiritually, because we all intuitively recognize that there's something more going on, that there are some undercurrents that we need to engage with, and I think that perhaps we might need to come back and pick some of these questions up, because they are such good questions. In fact, as I read these questions, can I just say, one of the challenges I think that we have before us is, in the midst of all of the outrage that we're experiencing around the world at the moment, through what's happened in America and the protest marches that have grown from there to go all the way around the world to what's happening in Hong Kong. And we shouldn't neglect that either. I don't think we should turn away from what's happening there, because I think it raises some very real issues. And not only does it raise issues, I think it begs some questions as to how some governments are responding and some aren't, in terms of the support that they are offering to people in Hong Kong. I'm not sure what you call people in Hong Kong. But yeah, so I don't think we should pull away from that. But here's what I think we should do as Christians. I think we should learn to turn that outrage into outreach. I really do. I think we've got to find a way of channeling the outrage that we feel towards some of these things into outreach, reaching out with hope, reaching out with grace, reaching out with reconciliation, reaching out with the gospel, in order to move it beyond just moral outrage and indignation into something constructive and to something hopeful. Okay, so pardon me. Let me answer another of these questions. Another one of these questions: does the fact that a person is privileged put a responsibility on them to assist those who are not? I want to say absolutely it does. I think unequivocally, as I said this morning, there's nothing in and of itself wrong with privilege. It's what we do with it. I think that we should recognize that there are some privileges that are by virtue of where we are born and the culture, and the socioeconomic strata that we're born into, and there's nothing we can do about that, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it, but it's what we do with it. But there are also some privileges that I guess that we would say those are natural, some are by design of God. In fact, I would want to say perhaps that all of our privileges from God, because He's chosen the times, the places, the circumstances into which we would be born. And we see in Scripture, as I mentioned this morning from 1 John 3, that there's nothing wrong with privilege, it's what we do with it. But we see that worked out in Scripture more fully in how God has privileged people for the benefit of others, and what that can look like in your life and mine. I think of Moses, for example, who was privileged. He was a baby who essentially was abandoned at birth, not by choice, but by government decree, by God's design. He was picked up into the royal family. He benefited from all that, and that privilege gave him a platform, ultimately, that God was able to, God leveraged for the sake of for the sake of the Hebrews, and God placed them where He did for that reason. Esther is another person in the Scriptures who we see God gave privilege to, and how that was leveraged for the sake of others. Esther, as you know the story, she was Queen Vashti upset the king one day, and so she was royally deposed, I guess is the polite way of putting it. The king wanted to find a beautiful bride in the place, and long story short, Esther was the one. She was a Jew. Jews weren't favoured. She kept it quiet, but she knew that God had placed her there for a season, and ultimately it came out, and God used her powerfully to protect a whole group of people, a whole nation, if you will. And so we see privilege being used constructively there. So we do have a responsibility. I think the Scriptures say we have a responsibility to use our privilege for the sake of others. We need to recognize what we've got and serve others out of it, whether it be our neighbour, whether it be colleagues, whether it be people who are different from us. We must use our privilege for other people. Let me come to the next one here. I like this question here. So look at it, it's quite challenging in a positive way. Given what you said this morning, should we respond to people of other faiths the same way? That's a really good question. What did I say this morning? I talked about how about what makes Black Lives Matter is that they matter because they're made in the image of God. Their life matters because our life matters, and we shouldn't collapse one into another. We shouldn't minimize people. We shouldn't look beyond racial tones and everything else, and just try and see them as in this broad category human, as though we're all equal. We're all equal in our value, but we're all different as well. And so how does that apply to people of other faiths? Well, I can think of a couple of examples in Scripture that would influence the way that I approach people of other faiths. I want to begin prefacing by saying that we would treat people of other faiths as people, full stop, the same as we would treat anybody. Just because they have another faith doesn't put them into another category of humanity. They are equal because they are human, made in the image of God. The fact that they have another faith is a complicating factor of how we respond, but it shouldn't be a barrier to engaging with them. It shouldn't cause us to see them as anything less than human. It shouldn't cause us to pull back and treat them in some way that we wouldn't treat someone else. Having said that, how would we engage with them? Well, I can think in John's Gospel, I think in John chapter 4, there's that very poignant interaction, I guess, between Jesus and the Samaritan woman, which I think gives us some indication of how Jesus approaches people of other faiths. She wasn't a Jew. She had a concept of God. It was a derivation of Judaism, but it wasn't Judaism in that sense. And what he did was he engaged her in her everyday life, and he built in a very short space of time, because he's Jesus, he's God, he can do that. He just built a natural rapport with her and built trust and built this connection through an everyday situation that allowed him to have a conversation with her that opened up possibilities. And the way that he did that, I think, is instructive. Now, if you read the story, if you go back and read the story of the Samaritan at the well, the woman at the well, the Samaritan, what he did was if you look at it, he shows an understanding of her culture. There is cultural awareness, so that he's shows sympathetic or he's empathetic to her upbringing, to her context, to her culture. He understands what that means for her life and her lifestyle, and where some boundaries are. He doesn't rubbish her faith. He doesn't diminish her faith. He doesn't say that, what you believe is wrong and you're silly and all those sorts of things. He doesn't get into a full-on head-on debate with her. Instead, he engages her in order to move her beyond her faith to something greater, which was himself. And as a consequence, we know what happened. She went and got back home and got everybody and brought them out to meet Jesus that day. And I think it shows a really good way of engaging with other people of other faiths. We treat them as people first and foremost, which means we take them seriously, we validate them in their humanity, and we engage with them, we show empathy, all of those sorts of things. But it doesn't mean to say that we accept their faith. We're accepting their humanity, we're accepting them, and we're engaging in faith, and we are having a conversation that is respectful. Sadly, so many Christians today, I think, are very disrespectful of other faiths. There's instead of a humility, there is an arrogance, and I think that's detrimental to engaging people. I think also in 1 Corinthians 9, Yeah, 1 Corinthians 9 of the Apostle Paul, who talks about to the Jew he became a Jew, to the Gentile he became a Gentile, to the slave he lived as a slave, and all those things. And he said, without compromising his faith, without compromising the gospel, he did this in order to reach them. And again, I think it helps us get an insight into how to engage people who are different, who have a different faith from us. He entered into their world, into their humanity, so that he could understand their context in ways that perhaps just looking from the outside in would prevent. So he understood their life struggles. As I said this morning, that when he talks about in Galatians about there being no Jew nor Gentile, man nor woman, slave nor free, and all those things, he wasn't diminishing people's position in life. He wasn't diminishing difference. He wasn't minimizing any of those things. He wasn't collapsing them into just this broad thing called Christian. He was saying that we are different and we have different experiences, and our unity is understanding or recognizing those different experiences, and then developing an understanding of how that impacts life so that we can engage more fully and be enriched as a consequence. And this is what's happening in 1 Corinthians 9, I believe. What he's doing is he is saying that I entered into their world to understand their world and how it shapes the way in which they live, the way in which they experience life, so that I could preach the good news in ways that had a context and could make a difference. Instead of just standing on the outside and saying you need to believe and this is where you're wrong, he engaged them, and as a consequence of that relationship, he was able to build bridges, if you will, between the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ and them, and win them over. And so I use those two examples as illustrative, I guess, of how I would approach this whole issue of treating people of other faiths. We respect their humanity. We afford them the full dignity that we'd afford anybody else, but we don't have to accept their faith. But that doesn't give us then the right to rubbish their faith. We have to show respect for them if we want to build a dialogue and have them respect us. And as we do that, then we can begin to break down some of the walls, some of the divides, and basically do for them what Jesus had to do in your life and mine, and come and meet us where we're at and lead us out of that so that we could begin to recognize the truth. Remember, it's the truth that sets us free. So that's how I would respond to people of other faiths. Recognize them as good people. Recognize them as sincere. As a generalization, we're not talking the fanatics and all those things, although, again, they're still people. So it raises another question, doesn't it? But that's how I would engage with that. I hope that's helpful. Thank you for speaking about how to respond to Black Lives Matter and the deeper issues it represents. Do you think it is possible to be colourblind? The short answer is it's possible for some of us to be colourblind, because I am. But for most of us, no. I sincerely don't think it's possible to be colourblind. I think that we are blind to the fact that we're not colourblind. I think we genuinely believe we're colourblind, but I don't think we are. I think the reality is that we all see life from a particular perspective. We see life from our perspective, and our perspective is shaped by a lot of things, including colour. The reality is that if you are not a European, your experiences and the way that shapes the way that you understand or interact with life and how you respond is going to be different from mine, by virtue of the fact that I am. It doesn't make me better, or it doesn't make me worse, it just makes me different. And so what happens is that our natural tendency is to normalize our experience and assume that our experience is the same for everyone else. It's just a subconscious thing. I don't think we consciously make that decision. It's like the whole fish and water type thing. You know, a fish, you can't describe water to a fish because that's all it knows. And it's not until you take it out that it recognizes, oh, so this is water, I need it. In the same way, I think it's not until we are confronted with something that we appreciate what we take for granted. You know, certainly I know from my own experience, for example, with Anne, I remember taking her with me one trip way back to Papua New Guinea, and we were in this village, and at this particular time there was one other European, and there was there was basically us, and there was 5,000 Papua New Guineans there in this particular place that we were speaking to, and it was, you really felt different. You really felt vulnerable. You really felt insecure because you stood out and people were looking, and it brought home this fact that you know, what we take for granted and everything else. So I don't think it's possible to be colourblind, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing because it should drive us to our knees in humility, to recognise that people see things differently. There are blind spots, as I've referred to this morning, that in our the way that we engage, and we need to be mindful of that. And I do genuinely think it cultivates an air of humility when we get to that point. And I think if you do think you're colourblind, I encourage you to have conversations with people who come from different cultures to yourself. If you are from overseas and you're living in, if you come from overseas to New Zealand or to the land in which you're watching this from, then you will have a greater awareness of other cultures and everything else than people who were born there. But nevertheless, the culture that you came from has shaped the lens through which you see things, and it will be slightly different. So that's my take on it. Let me just get rid of that one. Why do you think racism is getting worse? That's a good question. Why do I think racism... You know, I'm not sure that I think racism is getting worse. I think it's talked about a lot more. I think it's probably more, as what's put before us more, perhaps, than it's ever been. I think, who did I hear saying something recently? Will Smith. I think it was Will Smith. I could be wrong. If I'm wrong, please let me know. But I think it was Will Smith who said, racism isn't getting worse, it's just filmed now, or words to that effect. And I think he's right in the sense that it's always been there, but now because everyone's got a phone with them, racism, when it is seen, is being posted on social media in ways that it never was. I think it was always there. So not sure that I would say it's getting worse. I think it's just becoming, it's come to the surface a lot more, and I think it's coming to the surface for two reasons. One is those on the receiving end are saying no more because of the shifts in society, the way that we have broken down some walls, the way that we have empowered society compared to, say, the 50s and 60s and on it goes. So people are feeling that they can express things, perhaps, and I think also because that whole media thing, it's just bringing it to us in ways that we can't isolate ourselves from anymore. But I think it does raise a good question, you know, where does it come from and why is it there? And I think that's a good question to debate. I'm not sure it's getting any worse, but why are we seeing an increase perhaps of instances? And I guess I do have an opinion on that. You know, for me personally, I think there are two parts to racism which we need to recognise. The first is that I think racism is a tool of our spiritual enemy, the devil. I really do. I think it's part of the enemy's plan we know from what Jesus said, the enemy's plan is to divide in John 10:10, for example. And so one of the areas that he's going to divide is is along racial grounds, because if he can pit one group against another, create suspicion and mistrust and conflict, then it takes our eyes off the gospel, it takes our eyes off things of the kingdom of heaven, and it's pitting us against one another. And I think Jesus himself reminds us that our enemy is behind all this. And in John 8:44, I think it is. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. But Jesus is talking to the Pharisees. He's questioning the Pharisees, and he just says to them, your father is the father of lies. And number one, and so anything that's contrary to God is a lie, and we know that racism is contrary to God. And then he says, what is spoken in the dark will be brought to the light. And I think what we're seeing is some of the stuff coming to the surface, what is spoken in the dark. Kids don't grow up innately racist. They learn it at the home. They hear these little subtle racist jokes, only they're not jokes. Where do they learn those phrases? I was talking with someone last week from church, and this person was just sharing with me when they were young at school, relatively new immigrants, and being called curry munchers. Well, the kid didn't learn that. It wasn't just part of their vocabulary. They had to pick it up from somewhere. Where did they pick it up from? I think it was spoken in the dark, so to speak, at home, and it finally found a voice in the light publicly, so to speak. And I think that's what we're seeing more and more and more. It's always been there because it's been the enemy's tool to divide, and now we're seeing it come to the light. And the reason I say that, talking about the father of lies and why I associate the two is that racism is an offence. It's an offence, I think, against God's character. And so that's why I say I think it comes from our spiritual enemy, the devil. And why I think it's part of his plan. I think racism is a contradiction of who God is. John 4:7, for example, the Bible says God is love. Not God has the capacity to love. It's not that God does love, but God is love. And racism is the antithesis of that. It's choosing not to love my neighbour. It's choosing not to recognise the humanity of someone else and accord them the full respect and everything else that goes with that as we would claim for ourselves. So therefore, it's a contradiction of God's character. It's an offence against God's character. And so where does all that come from? It comes from the fall. Who's behind the fall? Our spiritual enemy, the devil. And so that's how I understand racism and why I think it's so insidious, and why I think, pardon me, this casual racist joke thing is we have to draw a line through it, because it's like a seed that's being lodged in our spirit, and it's sort of normalizing an attitude that can take hold and slowly just become something bigger in our lives if we're not careful. So I think we should get rid of them from our vocabulary. So I hope that answers that question. As I say, these are really great questions. I'm really encouraged and really humbled by the engagement. Let me grab another one here. Okay. So here's a question just to break this whole, I might leave this one to the end, I'll come back. If our race, gender, class, etc. means we all experience life differently, does that justify people's behaviour? That's a great question. Does that justify people's behaviour? The short answer is no. I want to say no, it doesn't justify behaviour, but it explains it. I think it helps explain why people respond or react the way they do. And therein, I think, is the significance of learning to having those conversations with people who are different, so that you can be enriched and your perspective is enlarged. Because what happens is people always respond. You respond and you react out of who you are. And you are the sum total of your life experiences. And faith is an integral part of that, no question. But the reason that you don't always respond in faith, and the reason I don't always respond in faith, is because we're not perfect. Paul himself said, I find myself doing things I didn't want to do or don't want to do, and I find myself not doing the things I do want to do. And sin is at work in us. There's a corruption of God's nature in us. There's a fight, if you will, between the two natures, our human nature, fallen human nature, and God's nature being created in us. And there's that creates that tension. And that if the more we understand each other and life's experiences, the more we begin to appreciate why people respond the way they do, and why they react at times in ways that may take you by surprise. And so if we can understand one another, it doesn't justify or excuse behavior, but it explains it, and that helps us begin to then move beyond that and help one another find better ways, more creative ways, more healthy ways of relating. And if we can do that, then again, it breaks down some of the walls that divide. It breaks down some of the attitudes and behaviours that pit us against one another, even subconsciously, and helps build that unity. Builds bridges for the gospel. It helps create a sense of trust between people. So I don't think our differences justify. I think our differences explain. And I think it's a very subtle but significant shift, I think, that has to take place in our awareness. And if we can do that, I think it'll move the conversation into some new and I think hopefully some pretty interesting territory, because we could then begin to get to the root of some things as to why we respond the way that we do. I was having a conversation with someone recently about some things, and they would tend to respond in some very particular ways, in ways that I thought were out of character with the person that I knew them to be. And so I took them aside, and we were having coffee, and I just sort of observing. I just reflected back to them my observation about some behaviours when in response to some things that seems to come up from time to time. And long story short, what I came to appreciate about it was that there was a significant person in this person's life, and it seemed no matter what they in their mind, no matter what they did, it felt like they could never please that person, and it just crushed them inside. And so as an adult, they just were more sophisticated at responding out of that. But inevitably, when people who they looked up to didn't acknowledge it or said something that they felt was a put down, without even being aware, that button was pushed, and they would react negatively out of that. And once they became aware of it, we talked about it. We're putting in place some strategies to deal with that, so they react more positively, because it wasn't helpful for them in that sense. So that's why I think understanding each other's experiences is constructive and positive. I also think it would enrich our understanding of life in general, to understand that, to get an insight into how other people perceive life, and it'll enrich us and help us become better. Okay, how's time? Okay, wow, there's some tough ones here. Okay, do Christians in New Zealand have a special obligation or responsibility towards tangata whenua? If so, what should that be? Wow. For those of you who are watching from overseas, or perhaps not familiar with the term, tangata whenua is just we're talking about the people of the land, the Maori people who arrived here in New Zealand before we did. First Peoples is just another term it's the indigenous term here in New Zealand for First People. Do Christians in New Zealand have a special obligation or responsibility towards them? If so, what should that be? Yeah, the short answer is I think we do. I think we do have a responsibility to them we have a responsibility to acknowledge them. We have a responsibility to understand the culture into which we have come, and it's to understand their worldview and their perspective, in order to be able to appreciate them and their experiences, and then to, as a consequence, to be able to validate their humanity and to be able to build bridges for the gospel of Jesus Christ. I think we, in terms of, does being First Peoples mean that they have a prior claim culturally to customs and to all those sorts of things that should change you and I, or limit our freedoms and limit our things and all that? I think that's a whole separate conversation that we could have around the implications of some of that, because I do think the Bible does have something to say around that, and I think the boundaries biblically may not be where we may draw them in this country at any rate. But I think we have an obligation to honour them and to recognise their First People status, their tangata whenua status, and to celebrate everything that can be celebrated within that, just the same as we would want to be celebrated in our cultural context as well, and to then look at what that means for us. How do we live together? How do we build constructively? How do we honour one another? Because again, I think what has been missing in the debate, particularly in my experience here in New Zealand, and I've had to go through some pretty intense bicultural workshops, as some of you would have as well, is that it tends to be very one-sided in terms of prioritising the rights of one over the rights of the other, and all it's doing is it's not correcting, in my view, something that needs to be corrected. It's just shifting the weight from one wrong to another wrong, and that doesn't achieve anything. In fact, we're seeing that it's not actually working. So that's a conversation that we need to have, I think. If Hannah was here, I'd get her to save that. I'm not sure how we do that, so I'm gonna leave that up on the feed so that it doesn't disappear, because I don't know how to. She just does her Hannah magic and sprinkles her Hannah dust, and it all just happens for me. Okay, so we often hear that Maori fare badly because of past injustices and intergenerational trauma. What is a biblical response to such a statement? Wow. I'm going to make the assumption here, whoever asked that you are my friend, you're not trying to set me up. That is such a big thing. It's a good question, though. It's a question we need to engage with. I'll give it a short answer, and again, I'm going to leave that one up and come back to it, because I think there's so much in there that pertains to the whole global dynamic at the moment as well, and I do think that it's a good question, because it's a concrete expression of some of the tensions that are evident, and some building tensions as well in our country. And if we don't face them and deal with them, then they're going to erupt in some fashion, as we see them erupting overseas. So I'm not trying to push it aside. I just want to do it justice, and I can't do it justice quickly. So let me just give you a short answer, and I promise that that we will come back to that in the next few weeks. What is a biblical response to injustice and intergenerational trauma? The bottom line is that where there is injustice, we work to put it right. And where there is an injustice, it begins by acknowledging that injustice and acknowledging any part that's, in this context, we may have had to play in that. I think, to be fair to us as a country, I think that we have been very good at acknowledging injustices. I think that we have probably in many ways led the way internationally on how to acknowledge injustice towards First Peoples, and I think we've gone a long way to doing that. there's, I think, still some work to be done, but I think the majority of it has been done. I think a lot of what we are experiencing today is not a failure to acknowledge them. It's I think it's a perversion, if I can use that term in its best sense. By that I mean in its biblical sense, I guess, of truth and justice. I think it's been manipulated and being used as a weapon in ways that it was never intended to be. And I think we need to be aware of that and do something about it. The biblical response is to acknowledge the injustice and then begins to work it through. Intergenerational trauma, where I think spiritually we can break some stuff off in prayer, and I think that we can achieve a great deal by interceding and bringing the kingdom of God to bear in that. But there are also some other things within that as well that the tangata whenua have to own, the Maori have to own, because it's not just some of the injustices were not just from the Europeans from when we first arrived, but there was also the conflict internally, and we lived as minority in an area of New Zealand where we were in a minority, and it was quite interesting hearing the stories from and the conflict and the deep hurt of the different Maori groups where we lived, and how they viewed one another. And it was just easier to take those out on Europeans than it was to face one another and work it through. So I think it's very complex. I think our role as Christians is to pray, and to pray. And I think we can see some great things happen as a consequence. That is such a great question. It's such a good question. Okay, let's come up to the top. Let me just take a break. I like the way you connect influence to character and not position. I'm guessing that's in regards to one of the Thrive videos. I think I might have done a Thrive during the week on influence and about character. How do you build influence in the workplace? That's a great question. How do you build influence? I think building influence really starts with self-awareness, in my view. I'm sure there are books written about it, and well, I know there are. I think influence starts with self-awareness. It becomes recognizing who you are, your values, all of the things that make you who you are, the things that you're not negotiables, and live it so that you can live out of that consistently, because that speaks volumes to people. I think it's self-awareness in terms of being aware of your strengths and your weaknesses, and what buttons you have as best you can, so that you can take steps to respond to people rather than react to people. And I think if you're going to develop influence, you have to begin with self-awareness, because if you're not self-aware, then you can't really build authentic relationships with other people, because there's a sense around them that they're not genuine, that you know they're not really deep, that you're not really preferring the other person as better than yourself, as the scriptures talk about. So I think it begins with self-awareness. And then for me, Matthew 7, verse 12, Jesus talks about how we should treat others as we want to be treated. And in my experience, that if you want to have influence, influence is not about getting your way. It's about being a person of influence. It's about being the type of person that people look to, that people want to hang around, that people value, that people respect their opinion, and they trust them, they feel safe with them. And so treating others as you want to be treated is another crucial thing in my view. It's to show people that you value them for who they are. It's to it comes back to what we've been talking about tonight, recognizing their humanity, recognizing and validating their rights to life, that they are unique, that they are special, that their perspective and everything else is just as valid as yours, and that that you value them for who they are, not simply for what they bring to the table. You value them because they're made in the image of God, that they're people who draw breath from the Most High because He's ordained it. So you're valuing them for who they are. Matthew 7:12, I think it should be a life verse for all of us. It should be on all of our fridge doors. So first thing in the morning when we make our coffee, we say, treat others today as you want to be treated. I imagine how that would shape our work day. And so we do that, and then I think, invest time in people, and by that I mean really listen and pay attention. So often, what happens is in work situations, and maybe you can relate to this. I'm sure that it's happened in your work environment, that in the course of conversation, somebody said something, and you've gone, "Oh, I didn't know you like that," or "Oh, I had no idea you were into that." And what that says is that you don't really know me. You don't really understand me. And it's not a put down, it's just a statement that when you respond like that to somebody, you're saying that you've never really taken the time to get to know them. You've never really noticed the little things. We all notice the big things. We all notice, but it's the little things that make a difference. It's the little things that show that you are paying attention, that you are valuing the person, that you recognize things that other people overlook. And that's what builds influence, because influence comes out of character. You're showing that you care about them. It's that whole do unto others thing being played out. Listening to people is really important. Everybody hears people, but not everybody listens to people. We all hear the noise that comes out of people's mouths, but we don't always listen or attend to that noise. And when you do, you're actually gaining influence, because you're showing, you're actually lifting them up, so to speak. You're actually paying attention to them, and that goes a long way. You're treating them as Jesus would treat you. And then I think you need to, once you do that, you can, influence is about showing respect and valuing people's opinions and all of those things. It's being a safe person. It's letting them have a different opinion from you. It's letting them share something. It's letting them work out their thoughts and be able to journey. And I think these are always important things. That's what to influence is. It's a whole combination of things. It's just living out of character. It's letting people be people and everything else. And I think a way of building that is also not just listening and not just respecting, but also serving them. Jesus, as Christians, it should come naturally to us. Jesus says, I came to serve, not to be served. And I think we can do that. It's the little things. I haven't worked in this type of environment for a while, but I took a couple of years breather from pastoral ministry, and I was working for a Christian mission organisation in the office, and I became aware that at certain times of the month and at certain times of the year, our office was under a lot of pressure, and I wasn't in charge or anything like that. I just I was in my desk was in the corner. I was on the road a lot, so to speak, travelling a lot, but I became aware of these dynamics, and so I made sure that I changed my diary at certain times of the year and at certain times of the month to be there, to come and just say, look, what do you want me to do? I'm here to serve. Not because I wanted to curry favour with them or get brownie points. I wanted to serve them because they served me. I was the public face, if you will, of our organisation, but I couldn't do what I did without them. So now it was my turn to serve them, and it's just little things like that. It's just serving in whatever ways could, bringing in coffee. It's just serving them. If you do these things, it's all about building. It's all about character development. It's about recognizing other people. That will build your influence in ways that you won't believe, because you're showing that you're trustworthy. Your values are shaping the way you respond. It's not just something you say, it's something you do, it's something you live. All of these things, and that's what That's what influence is about in my view. So I hope that helps. Let me do that one. Okay. Loved your sermon this morning. What do you think is an appropriate individual response? And what could the church do as a corporate body? Wow. Okay. What do you think is an appropriate individual response? I think a great place to start is to pray. To intercede, as I talked about this morning, interceding about, let up there, come down here, the whole Lord's Prayer thing, as on heaven, let it be on earth. It's just let up there, be down here. Praying, interceding, praying and letting God speak to you about your blind spots, about attitude adjustments, those sorts of things. I think it's about refusing to be part of perpetuating division. I think that's what can you do tomorrow in the office. I think one of the most confronting probably things that you could do in the office tomorrow to begin to break some of these destructive, divisive behaviours is to refuse to be part of office gossip, because office gossip is really just it's just a shade, if you will, of an expression of division of which racism is a part, because it's dividing people, it's belittling people, it's playing one person off against another, it's denigrating them. They may not be denigrating them racially, but it's still denigrating them humanly speaking. Just refuse to be part of that. Just say no. No. When you speak to that person, when you speak about that person, what you're really telling me is that I can't trust you, because how do I know you're not going to speak like that about me to someone else? And how can I have confidence in you if that's how you're going to treat other people? How can I have confidence that in you as a person and your integrity? And you've got to find a way of doing it. But I'd refuse to be part of gossip. I'd refuse as a consequence too. If you're going to do that, you must make sure you choose not to gossip, because otherwise you become a hypocrite. So do all those things. I think that's a good place to start. Make a point. Hey, if you're part of ALC, if you're part of ALC here in Wellington, you've got a great opportunity of just starting a dialogue with someone who's different from you and beginning to appreciate their life experience and how they perceive things. And as you do that, you could actually ask them. So, I'm genuinely asking you this: how have I been to you? Are there things that I've said and done that I'm not aware of that might have caused offence or that contributes to the problem? So it's just taking little steps like that. I don't think you need to take big steps. I think big steps are just a culmination of little steps gaining momentum. Learn to walk before you run, and I think if you just start in your own world to make changes, to refuse to be parts of divisive behaviour, you're going to make a huge difference. There'll be a cost, no question of that, but you're standing with Jesus, and that's what counts. As a church, as a corporate body, what can we do? That is a really good question. That's a really challenging question too. I guess for me, it's I guess as the senior pastor, here's where I'm at the moment, and I'm this is somewhere between thinking out loud and being a decisive strategy, if I can use that term. I really think that one of the things that God's calling us as a church to do, I guess, is to become more active. Let me rephrase it. I think there's a place for activism within our church, and that's not. That's not a comfortable thing for me to be talking about, because that's not how I'm wired. I avoid those sorts of things. But I think that we have to look at Jesus' example of activism What did he? What, he turning the tables over in the temple was a form of activism. Taking a stand and not condemning the woman caught in adultery is a form of activism. I think we've got to find our voice in that, and I don't know what that's going to look like, but we can no longer just stay within the confines of our church and preach about things and the hope that I can no longer preach to you and say this is what I think you need to do and hope that you would do it as I do it in my life. I think as a church we've got to translate that into corporate action as well. And just saying that scares me a little because I don't know where it's going to go and what it's going to look like, but I honestly think that's the next step for us corporately. So there you've got it. Pray for wisdom for me and the leaders. Pray for revelation and wisdom because we need it. But yeah, we can't stand still anymore. We can't sit on the sidelines. And I guess that's all I can say at this point. I don't have anything more concrete than that in terms of our corporate response. So certainly if that's your question or you've got views, feel free to email me, hamish@alc.org.nz, or message me on Facebook, private message me. I would love to have a conversation with you about what that might look like, about, I don't know. I know that I was challenged personally, convicted, same thing for me, by over the whole abortion thing where there was the protest marches, positive protests, silent marches, just being visibly saying, hey, you know what, we're going to get active about this. We're going to be seen to be standing for what we talk about privately in terms of our faith. And it made me feel uncomfortable because as much as I may come across as an extrovert at times, I'm an introvert, and that is a really difficult space for me to stand. But I really felt convicted that, man, I've got to be doing that. I've got to be part of that type of approach to some things. And I think as a church we do too. Okay, how are we doing for time? We've got time for one more question. We'll come back we'll pick the others up again. Wow, these are so good. Let me just get rid of that one so I don't confuse it. What is happening in America and Hong Kong relates to end time signs before the man of lawlessness is revealed as per 2 Thessalonians 2:3. What is happening? Is it what is happening? Is it a question? What is happening? Or is it a statement there? Let me come back to that one. Do I see a connection? Yeah, I do. I just need to be careful as to how I'd unpack that. So I'll definitely, I promise, if that's your question, I promise I will answer that, but just not tonight. Okay. Let's finish on a constructive note here. In one of the Thrive episodes, you talked about finding your passion. How do I do that when life is so busy? That's a great question. How do you go about finding your passion? No, well, let me begin by just saying I believe that you were created to be part of a solution to a problem that faces somebody, some group, somewhere. I believe all of our lives as Christians we were redeemed and created and set free to be part of a solution. And so I think I always begin by in terms of finding passion, what is the thing that really gets you going? What area of injustice, what problem in society, what issue is it that really just gets you going, in a sense? And generally just I would then start with that, and because that's going to give you the ballpark, and then just begin to unravel it. So for me, I began to realise that what really frustrated me more than anything else was just the way that so many people just lacked a sense of awareness around their life's purpose and everything else, and I really it really just became quite a passion for me that this is not how life should be, and that shouldn't be like this, and I began to really find that I came most alive when I was talking with people about stepping into God's plans for their life and what that looks like and how to do that and everything else. And I began to boil it down and boil it down and boil it down and boil it down until I came down to my to this thing that my life's call is to equip people to be the best version of themselves that God's created them to be. And that's my purpose in life. I get to do it through church, I get to do it through one-on-ones, I get to do it through everything else. But it started by this awareness that there's got to be more to life than this. Why aren't people experiencing what I'm experiencing? Why aren't people drawing from the well of salvation with joy? Why are people going through the motions? Why aren't people living out of their faith? And that's what sort of drove me to keep wrestling before God and to where I am now. So I say that because I think you've got a passion. You've got a passion and about something, and once you begin to sort of tease it out and unpack it, you'll find that there you'll discover something that God has wired you for, and you're going to be a solution. You want to offer solution, a biblical solution, a godly solution, a kingdom solution into something, into some sphere of life, and that's what you're going to do. That's passion as I understand it. Finding your passion. It's why, what drives you, what motivates you. Teachers are often motivated because they want to help kids succeed. They want to create a safe space, whatever, and so they move into education. That they've found their passion. It's the same for you and I. I'm going to do a series on that. Maybe not this year, thanks to COVID, but every 2 years we do that whole wired series about motivational gifts, and we're going to do another series slightly differently around just how to find your passion and what living out of that. So stay tuned for that. Our time is up. I really appreciate these questions. I'm going to leave them. I'll leave these ones here. Let me just get rid of that. I'll leave these ones up here, and I will come back to those in the next 2 weeks. We will come back to those. We won't do them all next week. We'll do some next week and some the week after, and we can keep adding to it if you like. But let's continue to keep this conversation alive. Let's keep listening to one another. Let's keep appreciating one another's perspectives. Let's keep growing as a consequence of that, and enriching one another through that we might together go forward as part of the solution that God has as we bring His kingdom to bear wherever we find ourselves. So I really appreciate your time tonight. I really appreciate your engagement with the questions, and thank you very much. Wherever you find yourself, know that you remain in my thoughts and prayers. I'm praying for you. I hope that you have a blessed week, no matter what comes your way, that you'll be aware of God's grace, providing for all your needs. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you so much.